I have 3 half butts in here. Hello, well, I've worked with so many hides like this one, and I thought it was time to share a good bit of knowledge about them. So I'm going to be covering quite a wide area about leather in this one. I'm going to be covering the different types of leather and the different cuts of leather, and telling you a few little things that I've picked up over the years. And I think if you're starting out in leather work, it should hopefully demystify quite a few of the things that crop up. And if you've perhaps done a bit before, it will maybe provide 1 or 2 little insights into my little world of leather and using leather. On the bench here I've got some vegetable tanned leather, and I've also got some chrome tanned leather. The chrome tanned is the red leather there. And I thought I'd better say a few things because I work pretty well exclusively with vegetable tanned leather, but it's worth making a mention of chrome tanned leather. So this chrome tanned leather is the sort of thing you'd find in a high street. A lot of bags are made out of it and other clothing items, etc. Aeroplane seats, car seats, yacht seats, leather sofas in your house, they're probably all done with chrome tan leather. And it has many good properties about it. It actually is, as you can see, flexible. It can be fire retardant, it can be treated, it can be coated, it has good abrasion qualities. And in many respects, I suppose it's the ideal leather from a manufacturing point of view. From an environmental point of view, it is less desirable than the vegetable tanned because they use a lot of chromium salts and other chemicals in the tannage, and that's polluting and not particularly friendly to the environment. The other thing about the chrome tan leather is obviously it's used in industry because they can tan it very quickly, therefore economically, and they can also coat it, roller it and give it like a grain effect. You can have a poor quality leather and you can slice it and you can roller it and colour it and dye it. So you get this leather which is really in many respects ideally suited for a mass market, but it loses so much along the way. We have this false grain stamped in here in the leather. It is of uniform colour, there's no character, there's no history or story to tell with this leather. To me, it's functional and useful for certain applications, but it's a bit dead really. I'll show you a bit of vegetable tanned leather just to give you a comparison. So I'm just rubbing some of the tannery wax away. This is a vegetable tanned leather. And as you look at the surface of it, you can see, for example, here there is a little scar. Now, I imagine a cow, in this instance, walked along a fence where perhaps there was a sharp nail or a bit of barbed wire, or they perhaps bumped into a bit of a tree branch or something. Something gave them that scar in their life. As you go and look at the grain more closely, you get all these like variations, and it just gives character. You can see there's this lovely sheen developing. This leather will patinate beautifully over time. It will have changes in colour across its surface. It's full of little natural imperfections provided by nature. As I get this wax off, I'll expose even more. As you go in closer, you can see the actual grain of the animal's skin. You can see little insect bites. So this leather has lived. It's a byproduct of the food industry. Now, apart from being kinder to the environment, this lovely vegetable tanned leather can be carved, it can be wet moulded, it can be stamped with your maker's mark. It can be stamped to make pictures. You can do all sorts of things with this. It has such character and flexibility, and I love it. Now, this is a full grain leather, so we've got the top of the sort of outer side of the skin all perfectly preserved and beautiful. Underneath that creamy white is the flesh side, and you can see all the little membrane marks on the flesh side. So you've got your two surfaces, your upper, which is the grain, and then your flesh inside here. This particular bit of leather is a half butt. It's a cow leather. You can get leather from quite a few different animals, and the four main sources, you've got calf leather, which is very good and sort of like lighter, so it's good for bags. I'll show you some calf leather. So here's a nice piece of calf leather. Again, it's got a lovely natural grain to it, so you can see the variation as you look across the hide. The surface varies as you go across. There's a nice weight. It's about 2 millimeters thick, and it's a sort of leather that will be very nice for bags. So that's calf leather. Close, fibrous, even, uniform leather. The other sort of main ones you'll get or come across is goat leather and sheep, and I'll show you some of that. Here's an example of some sheep leather, and you can see why it's good for garments, because it sort of flexes and folds. It's thinner and lighter, but still very strong and machines nicely. And then goat is very similar. It's generally thinner and smaller hides, and very good for things like bookbinding. Now, for a lot of leather projects, you'll probably be thinking in terms of cowhide. And what I've done here, I've attempted to show the whole hide as a little sketch, as if it's laid out, just to show you the different components. And for starting projects, if you're wanting to make some fairly small but tough leather items, and I'm thinking here of things like axe and drawer knife covers, or other fairly substantial things, shoulder is a very good part of the hide to go for. If you think of the hide overall, it could be about 45-50 square foot, so with a cowhide. So it's cut into bits because it would be rather large, and the different bits also have different uses. So shoulder is a great place to start. If you buy either a half shoulder or a full pair of shoulders, it's a fairly economical cut, and it's good for making some of the smaller items. The only real downside with the shoulder is, like our own shoulders, it will have more creases and sort of like wrinkles in it, because obviously your shoulders are more flexible and rounded. So as I say, great for smaller items, less so if you want to make something like belts. Now, if you want to do something like belts, the best bit of the hide is what's called the butt. So it's from the shoulders going back down the main back spine of the animal. So you've got this whole area is called a butt. What I buy when I buy belt leather is I buy what's called a half butt, sometimes called a bend, and it's like half the back area. So that's lovely straight, even grain. It's lovely solid leather. It's the best bit of the hide, and it will make a lovely belt. So you can either buy the whole butt, which is obviously quite expensive, or you can buy half a butt, which is still expensive, but half the price. What you don't particularly want, because it's soft and spongy, is the belly, the underside. So not a lot of uses for those, other than things like shoe soles and other projects where perhaps you want to do some moulding of the leather. It's not as strong, and you know, it's a bit more sort of spongy as well. So that's the main sort of parts of the hide. You get a bridle back, which is where you've got your shoulder, half your shoulder, and coming right down through your butt as well. So you can get your bridle back, as if you need very long bits. But I mean, a butt will be 5 foot coming down this way. If it's a half butt, it would be 2 foot across. So it's 5 foot by 2 foot. That's quite a lot of leather. If you want the whole back, then actually you begin to realise just how big a cow is. So very roughly 60 inches on your butt, but if you include another like 30 inches plus for your shoulder, you're up to 90, 100 inches. So you've got a very long strip of leather if you buy a whole bridle back, which is very useful if you need long bits of leather for belting or something, but otherwise it's generally more economical to cut it up into its separate component parts. Now when you buy cowhide, you can buy it either dyed, like brown, black, whatever, or you can buy undyed leather, and when it's undyed it's called russet, it's in its natural state, and it looks like this, so it's quite a light colour. As it gets exposed to sunlight, this will tan and go like to a golden sort of colour, which is actually quite attractive and quite nice. That's how it is if you buy in an undyed state. When you're buying a piece of leather, it's actually a good idea to give consideration to the thickness, because you can buy it in all sorts of thicknesses. I mean, this is all cowhide here, and I have a thin piece for like wallets and journals, which is just over 1 millimetre thick, and then I have some thicker, so this is some belt leather, that's 4 millimetres thick, and I have another piece of belt leather here which is even thicker at about just over 5 millimetres thick. You can get it so that it's split to different thicknesses. Obviously what you want is the nice top grain, the attractive side, and it's worthwhile sort of giving some thought as to what sort of thickness you want, because obviously if you're making things like moulded pouches, you probably don't want it too thick, and something at around about 2 millimetres is quite a nice sort of thickness to work with. If you're making a small pouch, if you're making a larger pouch, then you may want it to be getting towards 3 millimetres. Some people measure leather in terms of ounces per square foot, and if you go on the internet you can find tables that will tell you the sort of weights. Very crudely, if it's about 3 millimetres thick, that is roughly 8 ounce leather. You'll find there'll be conversion tables if you look them up. I tend to work in millimetres because when I go and buy leather, I use this little gauge and I then know exactly what I'm buying. What you'll find with some of the hides, if you get sort of like very traditional tanned hides, they'll actually vary quite a lot in thickness over the hide. So they'll be fatter down towards the belly where the fibres are looser, and tighter and more compact up towards the backbone where they're firmer and more sort of resilient. And that really brings me on to the next thing, and that's called temper of the leather. Temper of leather is actually quite important, and it's not about whether it will have an argument with you. Temper is about how firm the leather is, and this piece of Sedgwick leather here is a very firm, tough leather. It has a hard temper. You press it and you can't really deform it by hand because it's tough. This piece of leather is still a tough piece of leather. It's a bit thicker, but it's slightly more fibrous. So it has a medium to hard temper. They do all vary, and you can obviously get softer leathers which have a soft temper, and that can affect the service you want to give to the item. I mean, if it's something like a rifle sling, there's probably a compromise between having hard temper for good resilience, but equally you want it to sort of softly mould to your shoulder, and then perhaps you want something with a slightly medium to hard type temper. But it's worth giving a bit of thought, and when you're buying a piece of leather, check the temper across the hide, because it does vary quite a bit, and you want to avoid particularly soft spots. If you find that a hide has some softer and some harder spots, it's worth looking at your temper. Finally, I just wanted to mention this kind of leather. It's a split. It's technically leather, but what it is, it's like a veneer cut from the lower surface of the leather. So it's not the top grain, it's where they've taken off the top grain as a nice thin piece of leather, and then you've left with another thin piece of leather from the hide. And split is often used in leather sort of on the high street, but it's not the sort of leather I think you'll want to work with yourself. Sometimes it's painted and coloured like this piece, so it sort of looks like leather, it sort of handles like leather, but it's got none of the attractiveness, none of the grain, and I would avoid it. The only good thing about a split, in my opinion, is if you want to use it for testing out a design, because you can buy a split very cheaply, and it's very useful because it will stitch like leather and vaguely look like leather. So if you're testing the shape of a bag or the size of a wallet, having some split leather is very useful for templating like that, and it's very cheap to buy. So I'd always recommend you go to good leather suppliers. People like Metropolitan Leather, and I've put up films where I'm using it, or people like AA Crack. They're very good leather merchants. They'll always be very straightforward and sell you some lovely quality leather, and they'll explain if you want to buy split, they'll be able to provide you with split, but you'll know what you get with people like them. They're well worth dealing with. But yeah, that's split leather. Well, I hope that's given you a bit more of an appetite to go and buy some leather and have a go at a bit of leather craft. And I've popped a couple of other films up that I'll link below in the description that might be helpful. So one is where I look at a complete cow and I lay out all the parts of a hide. So you'll actually see me laying out the shoulders, the bridle back, the sides, etc, etc, and give you a very good impression of what a whole hide looks like. And then I popped another film up a while back where I looked at different types of leather for different projects. And again, I'll put a link in the description below. I'm going to be doing quite a few films in this little series looking at the leather, so like fundamentals. So if you want to see them, please make sure you subscribe, and you'll hit the notification bell and you'll see them as they come in. But I'll be aiming to do quite a few where I'll look at various parts of the leather business that I've picked up over the past few years, which I think could be useful for you, and I'll go into quite a bit of depth with some of them, using different tools and projects and things like that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next film. Bye bye then.